Well, all right. Welcome everybody. Another episode of Legend Sports and Amplify, and we are talking baseball history, Negro League history, minor leagues, card art collecting, whatever your passion is for baseball and baseball history. And I am really, really excited today to have on, in my mind, a legend, one of my inspirations over the years. Since I'm really excited to have you on here, but author of Invisible Men, Donn Rogosin. How are you, Donn?
I'm good and happy to be with you.
All right, man. I really appreciate your time. I think these are the kinds of conversations I'm hoping that people can hear. The people who have been doing this for a long, long time. It's what I've been trying to do here for about the last 6 months or so, I guess. And I'm coming up on my 50th one of these, which is hard to believe. They just go by fast. But I've had on many of the authors, historians, researchers, people that put context to the recent announcements of Major League Baseball, uh, finally recognizing the Negro Leagues as major leagues, and Baseball Reference with the statistics. So it's just great to have you on here, and we're gonna get to talk about your work and why I think and why many people think how important it was at the time. So welcome, sir. I appreciate it. So in the late 60s into the 70s, there were a few authors, and the stature of these guys like yourself, John Hallway, Robert Peterson, who did that early work. What I love to hear what inspires people to get into what they're doing. The origin story. Professor Brunson kind of termed it that because and to me I like it. It's kind of superhero. It's what makes you who you were, and baseball has that. People get that in their blood. What was it about this story, and why you wanted to tell it, and why you were one of the first to do it back in the 70s and 80s?
Well, luck sometimes enters into life in a very big
Sure.
way. So I was teaching a course at the University of Texas called Sports in American Life, which was basically culture and sports, broad issues. And there was a requirement in the course to write a couple of papers. And a young man came to me and said, I don't know what to write my paper on. And I had just read an article about Willie Wells, great Negro League shortstop, greatest now in the Hall of Fame, who lived in Austin and would come and watch the University of Texas baseball team work out.
Wow.
And I think it was Kurt Bowles who wrote for the paper then, who's I think still involved, who wrote a little piece about him. And I suggested to the young man, why don't you, in lieu of a paper, I said, what do you care about? He said, the only thing I care about is NPR. I love working public radio. I said, okay, do a story about Willie Wells and turn it in as your assignment. And he did. And somehow that story got to Frank Mankiewicz, who was head of NPR at the time. And he was a baseball man. And the next thing I know, I'm invited to go to the radio station. He says, I've got some money for you if you will do a series for NPR on the Negro Baseball Leagues.
Nice.
And so I ended up writing a proposal to do it. There's a lot of little stuff involved with that. But the result was I was able to travel the country with a tape recorder and tape these players. And the key person in that was Monty Irvin, because Monty Irvin was working for the commissioner of baseball at the time. And he had been a protege of Willie Wells, who was with the Newark Eagles and managed it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Monty came in as a shortstop, and he loves to tell the story. Willie Wells saw him as a young man and said, Monty, you're a wonderful young man, but I'm the shortstop here. We need to make you into an outfielder. And those kind of stories. But by being able to drop Willie's name and Monty's name, all the guys opened their doors to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was able to tape interviews with many of the great players of that time. At that time, only Satchel Paige, Buck Leonard, Josh Gibson had been in the Hall of Fame more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these guys who are now in the Hall of Fame nobody had been interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm thinking of Leon Day, for example, people like that. And so I had this unique resource, and we made 4 one-hour programs on the story of the Negro Leagues
Mm-hmm.
for NPR. And that became the guts of my book, Invisible Men.
Awesome.
But at one of the Negro League reunions, which was held in Ashland, Kentucky, very early, Craig Davidson, my colleague and lifelong friend now, had started out to make a film about the Pittsburgh Crawfords.
Mm-hmm.
And we hooked up there, and basically he realized that if I asked the questions, he could do some more of the directorial things, lighting, the many things that come with making a film. And so he invited me to be part of the process for the film There Was Always Sunshine Someplace.
Awesome.
So really we have a film, a book, a radio series. I was very fortunate.
Awesome. How many interviews, how many players did you get to interview in that whole series?
I'm not sure the exact number, maybe 20, 25, something like that.
And then for the book, how many players did you sit and talk with to get their input?
Those were 25 guys.
Okay.
Because I would say fly from Austin, Texas to Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And then try to do all the guys that I could find in Pittsburgh, or similarly in Kansas City, or in the Washington area.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people weren't just players, but were sports writers. And being at the university, there were 2 great black newspapers of the day, Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender, covered the game. So I had access to the story somewhat through these great sports writers too.
And all of those stories to me, and it's what I've been trying to point out here, because I had a lot, I don't want to say a lot, but enough pushback that people were questioning when Major League Baseball made the announcement, Baseball Reference, because now they're seeing, the real stat heads, the guys who are really into the numbers. And baseball, I mean, yeah, I got to admit, I'm a baseball fan. I love numbers. I love the statistics. However, the Negro Leagues is more than that, for many reasons. The length of the schedule, the barnstorming that they did, not to mention, the obvious, the fact that they were playing under the conditions that they were at the time, in a segregated Jim Crow, the racism present at the time. Those conditions flipped the script.
Here's even another way to think about it, is that these were the best black athletes in the big country called America at the time. Sure, there was a little bit of basketball, there was a little bit of football. Somebody like Fats Jenkins was a great baseball and basketball player. But basically, and the teams had 15, 17 players on it, max. Pitchers finished the games.
Yes.
They didn't pitch 5 innings and then
sometimes 2 games a day. Yeah.
So you really can't compare the conditions. In that sense, you just know these were the greatest black athletes living in America at the time. The other thing is today, and this being an older guy now, and I've had a hip replacement and been in physical therapy, the amount of technology that can come into being just the physical experience, the icing them down, the knowing how to work with the muscles, the trainers. So I think the comparisons, they're fun, but in terms of validating what these players did, that's not the criteria.
Yeah, it's a fun little exercise that people like to go through, the Major League to Negro League equivalencies and, whatever formulas you come up with. And that's great and all. If you're trying to do that. But it's not the be-all, end-all with this, because there's the context of all this is important and the stories are important. When you were talking to these guys, let me ask you this about that. I'm sure you talked a little bit about numbers a little bit. However, did the stories when you were hearing them, there's a lot of mythology involved around around some of the stories. I mean, the famous ones. Cool Papa Bell was so fast he could get in bed before the lights went out, and Josh Gibson hit a ball 3 miles. Whatever the stories were, right? And they're fantastic. And every sport has those stories. But when you were talking to these guys, how did you feel? I mean, did you feel that they were what you were hearing was was it mythologized at all? What was your take on that?
Well, actually, the beauty of being there at that time that I was, which was after Peterson, a little bit, and after Hallway, who are the founding fathers of this, deserve all the credit. But by being there then, people weren't interested in their histories very much. And so
interesting.
These guys had a chance to tell their stories. So they went back after baseball, and many of the white players, by the way, had the similar experience. Baseball career ends, you're going back to work in the factory or taking another job or something like that. So, and it's often not always told their kids. So basically, they were eager to have their story told.
I bet.
They had no sense of how important they were in the culture.
That's amazing.
And if there's anything that I feel I was able to do, and it makes me feel really good,
absolutely,
is elevate their story to the center of Black life at that time.
Absolutely.
Because it was at the very center of the Black experience in every way imaginable.
Every way. I mean, baseball at the time that we're talking here, turn of the 19th, into the 20th century, all the way through, into the 50s and 60s, baseball was the sport. It was everywhere. It was in every single town, factory, farmhouse. It didn't matter. Everybody had a team. Everybody was proud to play on their team. And that's what I think was cool about the Negro Leagues, and a story that, I've tried to, bring these out so people realize this. There was no TV, very little radio, certainly, even way back when.
No air conditioning in the South.
Yeah, right. So when these guys came to play, people paid good money to see these guys play, and they brought a brand of baseball that was professional, and people were eager to see them play, and they played many times against Major League barnstorming teams, and it spread the brand of baseball to every part of the country, not just the country, the whole continent, and into Latin America. They spread it everywhere, and I don't think it's a story that I don't think they were ever given enough credit for that over the years, for sure.
Exactly.
I mean, the one thing when I had Professor Ruck on and Professor Burgos, Adrian Burgos, talking about the Caribbean, the Latin connection, that today you look at Major League Baseball, it's nearly half and half as far as demographics go, white and non-white players, but a lot of the Latin players, especially from the Dominican Republic, where did they begin? The roots go back to the Negro Leagues.
Well, yes, very much so. And it gives me a chance to promote a little bit, if I might.
Sure.
That my great colleague, Craig Davidson, and I, the first film was called There Was Always Sunshine Someplace. And that was the story of the Negro Leaguers in general, the history, the culture, everything of the Negro Leagues, with a little touch of what happened in Latin America, or maybe even more, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Mexico. But we then made, maybe 15 years ago, a film about the biggest name, Satchel Paige. But about 5 years ago, we started, and we said, well, let's finish this thing up properly. Let's tell the story of the American Negro Leaguers in Cuba. Because Rube Foster actually is the first great American Black to play in Cuba, founder of the Negro Leagues. He plays in Cuba as a pitcher, okay? And so he is the conduit into Cuba, and in the teens, the Detroit Tigers were practicing down in Cuba for spring training, the New York Giants. McGraw of the New York Giants owned a piece of the racetrack in Cuba.
Really?
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So Babe they bring Babe Ruth down there. So we have a bunch of these wonderful stories about this relationship in Cuba, and sort of as the wonderful little denouement to this 20th century. One of the key interviews in this film is with Tommy Lasorda, because Tommy Lasorda played in Cuba through, as he says with great amusement and wryness, 2 dictatorships, and his meeting with Castro and all that. Mm-hmm. So, there was just so much real life and history and texture in this Negro League story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like I said, the fact that they spread it everywhere, it was the entertainment of the day, and they were a big part of it. And it really, to me, hats off to them, because to persevere and continue, it's a great story that everybody I would hope would appreciate what they had to deal with and still perform at the levels that they did and be recognized for that. Now, they didn't get recognized a lot in many of the sporting news or any of those types of newspapers, but the players knew, Major League Baseball players knew, Major League Baseball management knew the talent of these players, and unfortunately, the keys to the kingdom were being held by people who were, for a long, long time, not going to allow that to go any further than it did.
Can I stir the pot for you, please?
Sure.
Okay, so what is Branch Rickey's contribution to baseball history? We know him with Jackie Robinson, of course. But the other thing that he was often credited with is the farm system and being the development of players. Well, when he was in St. Louis, his star pitcher was Dizzy Dean. Mm-hmm. Dizzy Dean was the guy that told Rickey, "You're not paying me enough. I'm going to barnstorm against Satchel Paige's All-Stars in 1934 and make money." So, of course, these guys knew everything about the Negro Leagues in the sense of, and plus, you say in New York, the New York Cubans would play in the Polo Grounds. The New York Black Yankees would play in Yankee Stadium when the Dodgers were there. They'd rent the stadium for a double header in Yankee Stadium and get a sellout crowd, but the white owners would insist on the concessionaires were their concessionaires, so they were making some money. So the story is very insightful into the nuances of race relations. During the segregated era.
Boy, oh boy, the layers of this, it's like the proverbial onion when you think about it, right? I mean, you had an obvious want, certainly I would think of the black community, to see these players finally make it to the major leagues, be given that recognition, and yet at the same time, many of the people who had their fingers in the pie, so to speak, maybe weren't so keen on that. I mean, you had booking agents, you had stadium owners, you had owners of other teams, you had the players sometimes themselves who were making more money doing that. The owners that were renting the stadium to Negro League teams when their team was on the road. I mean, so many of those layers and nuances that people, I don't think they really understand what this time period was like and how hard this was. I mean, the 1920 Negro National League wasn't the first time that they tried to start a league. They tried a few times before that. Rube Foster had a hand in a few of those. But finally in 1920 it sticks. And I'm sure there were plans to have, I've read stories here or there where they wanted to bring plans of bringing a whole black team into Major League Baseball. I don't know if that was true or not, but all of these plans to integrate much earlier than Jackie Robinson.
Some of the players thought that would be a logical thing because when they barnstormed against white Bob Feller's All-Stars with Major League players on it, it was white against black. And of course, Buck O'Neill mentions this to me, but he goes, when you got a fight and a white fighter and a black fighter in the ring, it's good for the gate, right?
Right.
And so, they thought that they could go in there as a all-black team at one time. There was discussion of that, but that was I don't think that was ever really in the cards
Hmm.
in a meaningful way, but it was certainly a topic they thought about and talked about among themselves.
One of the
And
things, one of the things to me that seemed a shame of it all, and you touched on this a little bit before, of the deep roots that the Negro Leagues and Black baseball had in the community. It was one of the largest, economic drivers, I'm sure. The day of a game was an event, certainly as you got into the 30s and 40s with the East-West All-Star Game and other events like that, where you'd have 50,000 people show up for a game, and it was a big, big deal. But then, now integration comes along, and they're all cut out of it now. I mean, the Negro Leagues went on for a little bit after that, but it was already a downbound train by the time you get into the 50s and
that's true.
beyond, and so
You know,
it's a shame that happened.
here's something to think about. When Jackie Robinson comes in, and then they have the denouement, if you want to use a big word, for the Negro Leagues. Here are some players who played in the Negro Leagues: Hank Aaron, Bob Gibson,
Hmm.
Willie Mays. You know, think about that. Now that's the rookie class of the Negro Leagues as it was going out.
Hmm.
Junior Gilliam. I
They
mean,
changed the game when they came in.
so yes. So I mean, there was a certain sadness. The very best ones were able to
Hmm.
become the stars and the names we know. The men that were older and didn't get to do it,
Hmm.
didn't really get to taste it. And it was sad because here's another vignette story. Ray Dandridge, third baseman, Hall of Fame player.
Hmm.
He was a huge star at the Minneapolis Millers in Minneapolis, St. Paul,
Hmm.
which was the New York Giant farm team. He was the most valuable player. He was older then. He had already near the end of his career.
Hmm.
And he told me he once asked Horace Stoneham, well, why didn't you bring me up? Why didn't you bring me up?
Hmm.
Horace Stoneham looked at him and said, well, but you're the drawing power for us in Minneapolis. Now, he said, and I'd never heard the expression before. It's very common, I guess. I just wanted to be there for a cup of coffee.
Hmm.
That's the expression Ray used.
Interesting.
So, but, that's the heart-wrenching human one interaction story that it has all the color of a time where some really, unfortunate things
Hmm.
happened because of this legacy of
Hmm.
segregation.
Hmm. It's interesting what you just said, because I've had several former major league players on. We've talked about other things, state of the game today, some things like that. But the thing I think that some people forget, and I think the pure stat heads forget, the real numbers guys. These guys are human beings. You know, that they're living lives, and yes, they're playing a sport, and it's awesome, and today they're making a lot of money. But put yourself back in, 100 years ago or ish, and think about, now these are human beings dealing with what they were dealing with. You can't put numbers on some of those things. It's a story that um, is beyond. I don't even know how to describe it. It's beyond being able to really put your fingers on. It's something that you have to kind of, in your experience, you heard them from the mouths of these guys, which I'm sure were incredible stories. But people need to, hear these viewpoints to get that context, because it's important. They're more than just numbers even today as they're becoming numbers. They're more than that.
Yeah, it's exact. But the thing and one of the reasons I'm so eager to talk like on your show is young people ask about this
Hmm.
experience,
Hmm.
and especially, you're a white guy for one,
Hmm.
and other things about it. But I get to tell them these were not bitter men. These were men who, because when they were young, they were on top of their world in a sense. They were known in the community. The people liked them. They were cheered. And so they had all that stuff inside of them.
Hmm.
And so there was a strength that comes with that, facing the
Absolutely.
adversities too. But and so don't diminish that. Don't focus only on the horrible racism of the time,
Mm-hmm.
because that is not the whole story. And all you need to do is think about the music of the time, was very
Mm-hmm.
happy music. They'd go to Latin America and bring back the Latin dances
Mm-hmm.
and be the first guy in the community
Awesome.
with a record from Puerto Rico. And, there was so much of that in their own experience.
Very cool.
So don't put them in a little container
Mm-hmm.
with just this, because they were big, and most of them learned.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them were just delightful human beings.
I can imagine. Um, One of the you touched on it a little bit, but one of the things, like you mentioned, from my perspective, I can only read about it. I cannot ever claim to know anything about what someone may or may not be feeling as far as anything in the way of racial tensions, those sorts of things. I truly, my wife is from Guadalajara. She's from Mexico. She has an accent, and so I experience it a little bit. When I see people deal with her, because with her accent, sometimes people, and she's a school teacher. She has a master's in special education. She's teaching their kids, but yet they hear her accent and immediately they make certain stereotypes. But anyway, so I can't claim to know any of this from a personal aspect. So my question was, why do you think in the beginning there was Hallway and Peterson and you and a few others maybe, but why was it white men that were trying to carry these stories? What was it that why wasn't there more in your viewpoint maybe of the community itself wanting to tell these stories?
Well, first of all, I think there was Phil Dixon, who's fabulous.
Yes,
Who was a young black man from Kansas City.
I've had Phil on.
Collect-
He's fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic guy, and he documented everything around Kansas City and keeps doing it.
Hmm.
And I highly recommend that. There was Janet Bruce, who worked at a museum in Kansas City, and she got interested in the monarchs and wrote the definitive book on the monarchs, Kansas City monarchs. So there were a few, there were a few women. There was a woman artist named Tina Hogat, who, if you were in my house and you'd look over there to my drawing she did of Willie Wells,
Awesome.
she was doing artists' work with them. But I think we were just all interested for different reasons. I mean, Peterson, I think because he was from New Jersey, there was quite a center of black baseball in Atlantic City and then Newark. And so it was very much in the air there. And I think he liked baseball. I had a few exchanges with him before, when my book came out. He was really great. And we got some stuff. And then Hallway, who had that tenacity to really get the story. And I would give Hallway and Peterson 90% of the credit, and Hallway maybe even a little more, for the fight to get Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
Because that's how they measured baseball. It's not a meaningless thing, because in their terms and in baseball terms for so long, the Hall of Fame was the measure. And so they, the fact that they were going to get that recognition. Now, it's very sad that some of them, the recognition came and only their kids knew it. Okay. So Willie Wells' daughter says, that Willie said, well, I know someday I'm going to get in. And of course, he passed before that. Leon Day gets told on his deathbed that he's in. Okay. He's in the hospital a few days before he dies.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, again, the poignancy of this stuff comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And something, there's some of the players that I knew and I talked to. So my experience is the dominant players of the 30s and 40s. Got to talk to a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Got to talk to a fair number of people who were young in the 20s as well. And we talked to a few who go even further back. Jess Hubbard, Dave Malarcher. There were some really spectacular guys who were figures even prior.
Mm-hmm.
But I would always ask, who's the best or who do you know, whatever. And the only one that I can really say unequivocally, I believe, absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame based on what the players told me is Newt Allen, second baseman of the Kansas City Monarchs, manager, long career, went on those trips to Japan
Mm-hmm.
with the great when they, was in California where the best players got picked to play in the California Winter League as well. So that's also another important criterion on who was great and who wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one player I always try to talk a little bit about. I know there's some others that are very
Mm-hmm.
highly thought of. I just don't have the data. Rap Dixon, some others.
Rap Dixon, Cannonball Redding.
Yeah.
There's a number of others. I wanted to, because I just think it's an interesting kind of the way it kind of tracks, because you obviously I think another driver was Ted Williams made that speech in I believe it was 1966 at the Hall of Fame and shone a light on it. But then, look at the timeline here. So Satchel Paige comes in 71. Josh Gibson, 72. Buck Leonard, 72. Monty Irvin, 73. Cool Papa Bell, 74. Judy Johnson, 75. Charleston, 76. DeHigo and Pop Lloyd, 77. Little bit of a lull. Rube Foster comes in, not as a player though, but as a executive and manager in 81. And then there's nothing. The only person who comes in the 1980s is Ray Dandridge in 87. And so I think at that point though, now comes along the Negro League Baseball Museum and Buck O'Neill and Larry Lester and many of those that were keeping these stories alive and telling the stories. And the Buck O'Neill, we'll get to him in a minute on his Hall of Fame bid. But and then Ken Burns' documentary kind of shone the light back on it. For whatever reason, people really seemed to resonate, I guess, with people quite a bit. And we have another burst of players that come in. Leon Day in 95, the year after Ken Burns. Bill Foster, 96. Willie Wells, 97. Bullet Rogan, 98. Smokey Joe Williams, 99. Turkey Stearns, 2000. Hilton Smith, 2001. And I think they had a plan there, to have them all, maybe one a year. But then it stops for a little while. And then they had the 17 that went in 2006. So they were Ray Brown, Willard Brown, Andy Cooper, Frank Grant, Pete Hill, Biz Mackey, Effa Manley, Jose Mendez, Alex Pompez, Composi, Louis Santop, Mule Suttles, Ben Taylor, Cristobal Torriente, Saul White, J.L. Wilkinson, and Judd Wilson. Now here we are, 15 years later. And you brought that up about Newt Allen. This plan now is the only way these guys are anybody else is going to get in from the Negro Leagues is if the committee that does the early baseball, which would be like pre-1950, puts them in. And that's only going to meet once every 10 years. What do you think is going to happen here?
See, I was blessed to get this story and get involved in it and all that. Mm-hmm. And had another kind of life. So I am not up to speed on the fine points of how all these things work. But what I think they should do is, frankly, they should invite Phil Dixon, myself, Larry Lester,
yes.
People who knew at that time, so they knew things firsthand, and then some of the historians. They should invite us up to the Cooperstown and talk to them as part of that process. Um, when you named the 17 that
Mm-hmm.
came in afterwards, well, Effa belongs in no
Mm-hmm.
matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Wilkinson belongs in no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's certain of those names that I know I just go, well, of course, it took way too long.
Mm-hmm.
I could, which I will not do, say, okay, if I'm in a meeting and I put Newt Allen against some of those names, and they say, Don, you can only choose one, I
That's
could
your pick.
make a certain argument, but it would be just one opinion. What Phil Dixon said, one of the problems in the Negro League history a little bit is East Coast versus Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chicago was the more important black baseball town. Basically, the three most important, probably black baseball towns were Kansas City, Chicago, and Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And New York was not.
Interesting,
But
right?
so many of the writers and the people so interested in it had a certain East Coast sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, that's what happened. But um, I think if they're going to meet once every 10 years, probably should be once every 5 years, maybe, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
You
I
would
don't
hope.
know, but I think if they would invite in some of us who knew Craig. By the way, my colleague who you said you're probably going to try to get on your show, which would be great, Craig, he went around for the filming of There Was Always Sunshine in Some Place and took pictures of all the scrapbooks, and
Wow.
his memory is even better, is good for that. And he should be in there, and he's a more statistic guy than me.
Mm-hmm.
But there are others. Larry Lester's work is great.
Mm-hmm.
There are some other people who did, and then there's people who did the special research on one little piece of it. So the people who wrote, Lubaski, who wrote the book on Satchel Paige, for example, and Josh
Mm-hmm.
Pickett, certain people have things to contribute to that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
If I actually have no sense of who that committee is,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's nothing I can say. I think Saber has done some good work
Mm-hmm.
for sure with the committees. I think that Ken Burns' film, 9-part series, kind of coalesced everything, because in that great summation, they had the great personality of Buck O'Neill.
Mm-hmm.
And so that reverberated in a way when we didn't have streaming. There weren't that many, people had, well, I know this for a fact because I've worked with Ken on other stuff, but he had no idea the Civil War was going to be the monster show that it became.
Mm-hmm.
And so it validated him. And then because he loves baseball, moved on to baseball at just the right time for the whole culture to grab a hold of it. That made, I think, all the difference for the later folks with Buck's personality.
Mm-hmm. And his not getting in 2006, and I think it was by one vote, if I'm not mistaken. What were your thoughts on that? That just seemed so
I didn't know it was
unfair.
one vote until you said that.
I think it was.
That makes me feel very sad, because he once said to me, how much he wanted that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just, that's tearful.
More, I mean, his play. If you're going to look at it strictly from a numbers perspective, he was a very, very good player. Yes. And there are many players in the Hall of Fame that you can go back and look at their statistics and go, huh, I wonder how he got in there. So it is more to being in the Hall of Fame than just numbers. So the body of everything that Buck O'Neill was,
Yes,
and everything he stood for, he should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think there's any doubt. And there's several others. I mean, like I said, Cannonball Redding is another one who comes to mind that I'm amazed he's not in there. John Donaldson is another one that I go.
A lot of people talk
wow.
about him. Cannonball always got talking to in the same context with Smokey Joe Williams.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, of course, Smokey Joe had that great name,
right?
among other things, and the great fastball. But of the, when you go through the people who weren't in for their baseball ability, so Effa, of course, Pompez, Wilkinson, you're talking. Have they put in Motley as an umpire yet? I don't know.
I don't believe so. Maybe I'm not sure.
He was but if you're talking about people for contributions to the game, and of course Buck O'Neill was the coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he actually is the first person to, in effect, be a manager in the major leagues.
Yes.
In his capacity as one of the 9 coaches for the Cubs. Bill Veeck, by the way, very important figure, of course, in this whole story. I think Bill Veeck was a piece of it. And and you mentioned your wife being from Guadalajara. The Mexican League story is a huge story. It's something that Craig and I are working on now, because when we finished our Cuban film, which we said was going to be the last thing we ever did, but then it's like when Buck ended his thing to us, is that we're not going to go again. That's it. It's the last thing. And then come spring, I'm ready to play. Let's tell this story. So we're starting to work a little bit on that, because we had a lot of taped interviews with people who were down in Mexico. Willie Wells was down in Mexico.
Wild Bill Wright. I want to hear more about Wild Bill Wright. That's a story I want to hear.
Well, I may talk to you after the show. Maybe some things that I don't. So, but anyway, but I think Buck O'Neill definitely belongs in for his contributions to baseball.
Absolutely.
Which, with time, I think that's the measure. Contributions to baseball. It's not a statistic thing.
And he may have more. I mean, so from what I gather on this whole process with the Hall of Fame is they have these era committees, right? So they've got this one that they're calling early baseball, which is pre-1950, which would include all of the Negro Leagues that are recently been recognized by Major League Baseball. And so that would be one opportunity for Buck O'Neill. He was playing then. But then the next one they go to is the golden era, the golden days they're calling it. Now that one meets every 5 years. And so that's 1950 to 1969. So, Buck O'Neill may have another opportunity since he spans into that as a coach. Maybe he would get into that, through that. But I hope he does. I think we're going to find out pretty soon who's on the short list in the coming months. So it would be great to see him on there.
Is that in the golden or in the other one as well? I'd love to know, because if Newt Allen gets on the short list, I will definitely call them up and at least sound off.
Absolutely, yeah. The golden one though, that's every 5 years. This early baseball one. So Newt Allen's career was 20s and 30s. Is that right?
Yeah, I think his first years might have been like 22 or something like that.
Yeah, because he was part of those early Monarchs teams. He
was a little bit before, but he was the St. Louis Stars too. He was, but his St. Louis thing. See, here's a thing to get the record straight. So Willie Wells was sort of my guy, in the sense that I had a lot of direct contribution with Willie. And first person things. But I did ask Willie, and said, well, Willie, who's the best second baseman? And he said Newt Allen. And then in talking about it, one of the criterion, I think, for Hall of Fame considerations, especially if they're a shortstop or a second base, is who's the best double play? Who's the, we watch those games now, and a really sharp combination matters. And arguably, the Willie Wells Newt Allen combination in the California would be the best double play combination in the Negro League history.
Absolutely.
So,
It's interesting about the Negro Leaguers because of, like you mentioned earlier, the short rosters. I mean, there was probably on some teams 10 to 15 guys, 17 max, if they even had that many. So they had to play many positions. You pitched, you played the field. Bullet Rogan batted, cleanup when he wasn't pitching, and played center field. I mean, those kinds of things. So it's hard to pin down sometimes guys at a position. But when you look at the people who are in the Hall of Fame now from the Negro Leagues, the only real kind of true second baseman that's even there is Frank Grant. And he, it just seems hard to believe. You're telling me, all these years of Negro League baseball, there's one second baseman that was good enough to be in the Hall of Fame? Come on. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. There's a lot missing right now from the Hall of Fame, just in terms of a logic perspective. To me, there's only like 3 or 4 outfielders in there. That's why Rap Dixon, when he's on a short list, he has to be. Because there's just, you've only got Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, Monty Irvin. I don't know. Is there anybody else that was a true outfielder? So Torriente is another one, but that's it. So, there's got to be more. I mean, it's just from a strictly logical perspective, that there needs to be more in there. Probably 30, 35, 40 more players that should go in, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
So the next project, the next thing I wanted to ask you, that's your next project you're working on is a documentary about the Negro Leagues in Mexico.
Well, we're talking about it. We're doing some preliminary work, and Craig is going through his archive for pictures and things like that, and we've been reading about it, and I hope it comes to pass.
Me too.
The story is great.
Absolutely.
For our Cuban film, we did interviews in Mexico because Martin Dihigo was a huge figure in Mexico as well as in Cuba, as well as in the Negro Leagues in the States. And so we did a series of interviews in Mexico about the Negro Leagues, mostly in Cuba, because Havana and Veracruz had a very close connection, baseball-wise. And ironically, in Veracruz, Mexico, you have the Cuban connection, because the Cuban Havana ship, the 2 big ports of the Spanish world, frankly, were there. But then you had oil being found, so the Americans from Texas were getting down into that area. And then, of course, Veracruz as a port was a very important entity in the whole Mexican story. And so a lot of things come together in this story, but the glue is the American Negro Leaguers who were down there. Satchel Paige was down there, Josh Gibson was down there, Willie Wells was down there, Ray Dandridge was down there. So, there's a lot going on.
Wild Bill Wright went down there and never came back.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing thing, and I think people think of Mexico as being a soccer country, and it is. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they love soccer is the sport in Mexico. But I know through my father-in-law that they are baseball fans as well. I mean, he loved Fernando. He became a Dodger fan because of Fernando. I mean, Fernando Mania was huge. And so, but yet he used to tell me, growing up as a kid, that that they remember the Negro Leagues. I don't remember the name of the family who was running the Mexican League in the 40s. But they had huge influence, and there were major league players who went down there to play. It was more than just Negro League players. So,
but even to this day, you probably know that there's always discussion of putting a team in San Antonio, maybe.
Yeah.
But also, and I've heard this from a major league owner, from his lips to my ears, that Major League was very interested would love to have a team in Mexico City.
I bet. I mean, look, what do you got? There's how many million people? 20 million
20
people
million.
that live in Mexico City. My God.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't see how you wouldn't have a sellout every single time, every
Well,
single night.
yeah, and the games that go on there, and of course Monterrey,
Hmm.
which is sort of the second city of Mexico. Guadalajara is the second city. We'll give them the third, right? Your
Hmm.
wife would probably fight about
She's
that.
a Guadalajara. She's from Guadalajara originally. So yeah.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
but Monterrey is a very important, and was
Hmm.
a very important center of Mexican
I
baseball.
went. I went to go see a baseball game there a couple of years ago, and at the time they were known as the Jalisco Charros.
Oh, okay.
Now they are the Guadalajara. Boy, they just rebranded this past year. Um, I I think they're the Mariachis. I think that's what they're going with. I think they're the Guadalajara Mariachis. I think is their new name. So I mean, Guadalajara is the home of mariachi and tequila. So I mean, that's you got to have a name, one of those two on there. Uh, so. I appreciate your time. Anything else that you've got on your mind that you wanted to talk about?
No, the only thing the last little thing would be, I love talking about this, particularly to college or high school, environments with our films, especially because it gives the texture and shows the guys.
Hmm.
The one thing I always tell the kids to leave is, you hit a home run in a big game as a young man, nobody can take that away from you.
Hmm.
You make a good play. If you have the camaraderie of the experience of team sport at this level, you've been given a gift.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And so don't feel sorry for these guys. Realize they didn't get what they deserved at all,
Hmm.
but they lived wonderful lives in many ways, and also that they were just great guys.
One of the biggest reasons I'm doing this as well, besides getting, the people who have worked so hard, like we've talked about, Phil Dixon, Larry Lester, Bob Kendrick, yourself, on and on, Gary Gillette, and on and on. There's so many that have worked so hard on this. But also to try to get younger people interested, because I'm hoping that there's got to be the next generation. There's so many more stories to tell. You're talking about the Mexican connection to the Negro Leagues as well, but there are so many stories, and they're all around you. I mean, every day on Twitter, I try to put out something about a small town where a player was born, so people can see that, you know what, there was at some point a player from your town. A barnstorming tour came through. There was a player from your hometown that played in a barnstorming game against the Negro Leagues. There's a footprint almost everywhere. Just look around and find it. You'd be surprised how what you might find. And I just had on last night Mitch Lutsky, who wrote a book about
Yeah.
St. Paul, right? And he said that as he was researching something totally different that had to do with Minnesota baseball, he kept coming across Page Fence Giants. He didn't even know who they were at the time when he was doing the research. And he wrote it down on a sticky. I'm going to have to remember this little story all the time. And he kept that sticky in a notebook. And then one day he opened it up, Page Fence Giants. And so it made him look, and it's like, wow, I didn't know any of this. And
Yeah.
that's really kind of how it is with a lot of this. There's so many stories to be told. I hope people take the time to learn a little bit, go back and read some of the great books. I do want to ask you this before we go. This is the third edition of your book, right? The original one, I think, came out in '83.
The book came out first with Athenaeum, and then they reprinted it as Macmillan.
Okay. And now you just recently, it just came out again, a third. Is this a third edition now?
Um,
It's got a new.
third or fourth.
It's got a new cover on it, right?
University of Nebraska Press.
It's got a new cover on it, I know, right? With the
Yeah,
bus and everything.
I requested that.
Did
because,
you?
What I did was, as this Negro League interest welled up again,
Hmm.
and we were approaching the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Negro Leagues, I wanted to reflect a bit on my own experience, but also just kind of put it in the record. And so I requested Nebraska Press, and they were kind enough to do this, that I'd like to write a new introduction. And then I whispered, can I have a new cover? I know what the old cover they were trying to do, but please give me a new cover, because maybe it would sell a few more.
Mhm.
But they graciously agreed. So I wrote, maybe an 8 or 10 page introduction where I kind of reflected on the
Yes.
change in the story. I mentioned Phil, who because the early days
Mhm.
that Craig and I met at that reunion when we first knew it, and I threw some bouquets to the people. There was a woman named Nancy Dickinson, and the people in Ashland, Kentucky, who were hosting a party for Clint Thomas, who was, after he retired from baseball, became this beloved figure in the West Virginia legislature as
Interesting.
a person just around the legislature. And Harry Wiley was the publicist for Ashland, Ohio, Ashland, Kentucky. And he and Nancy ran this tri-state fair and regatta. And they wanted to do something for Clint because Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, very much in common.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided to invite in the guys. And they hadn't seen each other in ages.
Awesome.
And they all came down. And so I wanted to put on record that. And then I do mention, I'm glad you mentioned it, Ted Williams' talk was very critical to the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
And I just put in a few of the things that I feel, and especially the point that these guys were happy men.
Mm-hmm.
The
Good. I'm glad. I think that's a perspective that maybe gets lost a little bit. I don't know, unless you've really, like you have, had the opportunity, and several people have, to sit down with some of these guys and hear those stories, you might have a whole totally different takeaway. I'm sure you get asked that a lot when you were teaching even as well, about what their attitude was towards it all. It's an important perspective to have. It's not all about being angry about something. You can make the best of it.
It's not good for your life.
Yeah, it's not.
Not good for your life.
Well, Donn, I appreciate your time. This was great. I literally could talk to you probably till the sun comes up tomorrow about some of this stuff, but I do appreciate your time. This was a lot of fun, and I'd love to talk to you some more down the road.
Okay, well, let's keep going. And
All right,
I
man.
really applaud what you're doing.
All right, man. Thank you. I'll
Take care.
Take care.